Good morning, everybody. Happy Thursday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Very busy day today here in the studio. We actually have two guests in town from Australia, two Australian members of parliament who are here to advocate for the release of Julian Assange. We're going to talk to them. We also have a presidential candidate coming in studio, Will Hurd. We're going to talk to him about how he sees the race and the dominance of Trump within the Republican Party and within the Republican primary, certainly. We also have big news about Ukraine, updates on Zelensky's visit here. We've got updates on that UAW strike that we want to bring to you. We also have some really interesting data about the way special elections have been going across the country, really painting a very different picture than the polls are painting, so we'll dig into that. Saagar is looking at a January 6th conviction, and I am looking at Ben Shapiro's commentary on the UAW strike, so a lot to get to this morning. Very exciting show.
That's right. We wanted to thank everybody again for people who've been signing up, premium subscribers. We've got an awesome interview that Jordan Cheriton did with Shawn Fain, the head of the UAW, about the strike, as well as some footage that he's been able to get from the strike itself. We're partnering with Jordan on that. Your hard-earned money is helping support some of this on-the-ground journalism. We're very proud to be able to bring that type of interview, that coverage, again, that we've been doing. And so this is an important part of our show and what you are signing up for. So breakingpoints.com, if you are able to. It really helps us to be able to support partners, creators like that, and to be able to bring this to a wide audience. We're really proud of the fact that some of our UAW coverage and more has gotten more ratings, than any other subject that we have done, which is why we get up in the morning. That's why we do the show.
Yeah, we were really excited to get to partner with Status Quo on that. And by the way, guys, give them some love too. Sign up and become members for them as well, because they do a lot of great on-the-ground reporting.
Yeah.
And I mean, they broke a lot of news this trip, both in talking to the workers. We've got some video for you that's exclusive for us about how they feel about this whole Trump coming into town and Joe Biden's speech and whether he's going to go to the picket line, and that interview with Shawn Fain where he also broke some news. So thank you guys so much for supporting us and making all of that happen.
Absolutely. Okay, let's get to Ukraine. So President Zelensky, the schedule changed up a little bit. He is coming to town here today on Thursday. He's going to be meeting with the full Senate and with the House as the actual Ukraine funding is on a knife's edge, as well as a complete government shutdown. But some of Zelensky's comments are certainly getting eyed at, not only at the United Nations, but in Poland. We're going to dig into all of that. By coming to the U.S., he's inadvertently ignited multiple diplomatic crises. The first at the UN, calling for the removal of Russia from the UN Permanent Security Council and for a policy of denuclearization against the state. Let's take a listen.
Ukraine gave up its third largest nuclear arsenal. The world then decided Russia should become a keeper of such power. Yet history shows it was Russia who deserved nuclear disarmament the most back in 1990s. And Russia deserves it now. Terrorists have no right to hold nuclear weapons. No right.
No right to hold nuclear weapons. So that is the policy that we've pursued against North Korea now for what, 40 some odd years. Ask somebody how it's worked out for them. But really what that is that is an explicit call for regime change. And that is the question of, is that what we support now? I mean, is that what the end goal of this war is to complete not only a regime change in Russia, but to subjugate Russia in order to take away their nuclear weapon status? I mean, this was not even, Krystal, the dream of the most Cold War hawks. In the 1990s. Like, even then, it was understood by the Clinton administration, by the Bush administration, others, like, listen, we have to make sure that we're not creating a situation where we're like occupying the country, taking nukes away, taking any ability for them to have any sort of sovereignty or national pride. I mean, he's effectively advocating for that at the United Nations. And that's why it is a stunning comment. He also, funnily enough, wants to swap Russia and Germany for permanent UN Security Council status. For those who don't know, the UN Security Council was, created after the World War II with the victors of World War II, and the idea being that these have a permanent objection, the ability to veto at the UNSC. Of course, there's lots of questions about whether that should stand or not. It's not like it particularly matters because the UN has all that much power. But I thought that the most significant call that he made there was for outright regime change in Russia as apparently one of the Ukrainian end goals. And in a way, I appreciate that. It's like, yeah, we should know exactly what they are working towards or what they want. And the question is does the United States, does Biden support the same?
That is at the beginning of the war,
he said it.
Some people were out in the administration were outright saying it. Now, we haven't heard that directly for a long time. It's hard to conclude that there's any other goal, though, when you see the nature of our escalating level of support. Certainly, I don't know if they are so fanciful to imagine at this point that I think there was some wish casting at the beginning that Putin's regime might just collapse without doing a whole lot, that they could easily weaken it, that it would fall apart, that they could, prop up whoever they hoped would be the successor, which we have always said, careful what you wish for, because it may seem like it can't get worse than Putin, but trust me, it 100% could get worse than Putin. So we always were, concerned about what could happen in the event that that was even a possibility, but it seems very unlikely at this point. I mean, there have been protests in favor of peace and against the war in Russia. Those have basically all fizzled out. You haven't seen a mass public revolt there. You had this one weird sort of semi-coup attempt that obviously has been dealt with and neutralized, to put it kindly at this point. So there's no sign that the regime is like in imminent danger of collapse. So perhaps they don't delude themselves into thinking that anymore. But it does beg the question, like, okay, what is the end game? And I would like to see more direct commentary from our own president, because as you said, Zelensky's certainly willing to put it out there. The other thing, listen, I would love to see worldwide global nuclear disarmament. I am not so foolish as to think that we are on the brink of that happening, and I certainly don't support, any sort of one-sided direction. And he also seems to indicate that, like, oh, actually, Ukraine should have kept the nukes.
Oh,
and Russia should have gotten rid of them.
That would have been way better.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so at the same time, President Zelensky here, he's got his hat out. He's coming to Washington today, asking for $25 billion more from the United States. And as part of that, he's been giving a lot of interviews. I've been keeping my eye very closely for the case that he's making to American lawmakers. And in the latest one, let's put this up there, during a CNN interview with Wolf Blitzer, he says, quote, "We are on the finishing line. I'm sure of that." Now, I really zeroed in on this because this is just a completely dishonest way of asking us for more money, Krystal. They need to be much more frank and honest about where the war is, just to give everybody an idea. I always talk about the map. Let's actually look at it. Let's put this up there here on the screen. This is from the counteroffensive. Now, what you can see in red is held by Russia. That's approximately 20% of all of Ukraine. What you can see in blue are the Ukrainian counteroffensive gains. Now, that black rectangle, for those who are watching, in the left side of the screen, Krystal, that was the goal of the counteroffensive, to go all the way from where that tiny little shaded area of blue is to the Sea of Azov, and to split the Russian defensives and to make a breakthrough against the entire defensive line. As you can see quite clearly from that, billions of dollars of weapons, who knows, untold hundreds of thousands wounded or dead, has got us the colored in blue shade line. That is, by any military definition, the starting line of said counteroffensive. It is not even close to the finishing line. If they were, even halfway through, I guess you could, exaggerate and say that's the case. I also think it fits with something that happened yesterday. There was an all-Senate briefing by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the intelligence community, and others. And Senator Josh Hawley, who attended that briefing, had this to say. This happened late last night, so we don't have the element. Quote, "If there is a path to victory in Ukraine, I did not hear it today. I heard there was going to be no end to funding requests. This latest request for what it is, $24 billion, is not the end." Quote, "They made that very clear. It is not close to the end. I would say we were basically told, buckle up and get out your checkbook." So U.S. policymakers have made the case to Congress. They are not saying what Zelensky's saying. They're like, no, this is going to be the first of many. This is just the first quarter. We're not, and don't forget that whenever the Biden administration requested that another $24 billion, they said this is just one of quarterly requests that will be forthcoming. So if we are to then annualize that, we are talking about $100 billion per year. $100 billion, again, is the same amount that we took 20 years to disperse to the entire Afghan National Security Forces through our entire time in Afghanistan. It's an extraordinary amount of money. And then relative to the gains that the Ukrainians are making, you cannot by any means say that this $24 billion or whatever is going to make, let's say, like a difference beyond marginal in what the gains are that are being said. And behind closed doors, that's what they're admitting. That's what they're admitting to our lawmakers.
These wars take on a sort of endless circular logic, where, the idea before the counteroffensive was, okay, we're gonna fund them, we're gonna equip them, they're gonna have this counteroffensive, and then maybe we can get to the table and they'll be in a stronger negotiating position. Now the logic is, since the counteroffensive didn't go well, we've got to, we got to keep funding them so they can try again and get a stronger position before they get to the negotiating table. It doesn't matter what really happens on the battlefield. There's always a logic in favor of continuing the conflict. And we've seen a number of, media sort of planted reports that have helped to attempt to seed the ground and to plant the seeds of this is just going to go on and on and on. So at the same time, put this next piece up on the screen from the Wall Street Journal. They have a good report here about how Zelensky's trip to Washington this time has a much different tone and character than the trip last time, which, he spoke to a joint session of Congress, and it was very sort of there was a lot of grandiosity around it. It was very assertive. This time he's going to be meeting privately behind closed doors with lawmakers, including, they say, some Republicans who want to grill him over a slow-moving counteroffensive and Ukraine's use of American assistance. This comes, of course, at a time right now when the Republicans are looking to shut down the government. They can't come to an agreement within their own caucus about what they want funding levels to be, and part of the disagreements revolve around aid to Ukraine. Now, there's a lot of reporting about how much the tenor and the tone has shifted in Washington. I would just say, keep in mind that in terms of elite elected politicians on the Republican side, you still have an overwhelming majority in favor of continuing aid to Ukraine. In the Republican caucus, you maybe have a third of the House Republican caucus that is at least in favor of reducing aid or not going forward with aid at all. So even within the Republican caucus in the House, you only have about a third that objects to continuing the direction that we have been going. So I do think some of the, the journalists, some of the writing coming out of D.C. about this big split and how some of the Ukrainian aid is really in danger and, it's on the precipice, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's a little bit overstated, just given the numbers that are still overwhelmingly in favor of continuing aid to Ukraine.
Yes, you're right. I spoke with some my Capitol Hill sources, and effectively what they're saying is look, we're going to fight as hard as we can. These are the people who are against adding aid, but here's the truth. It's the #1 establishment priority, and they're they will move heaven and earth to get this money through Congress. Now, I will say I would put it at a 10% chance that it doesn't pass, only for this reason. McCarthy has got an issue. They're facing a potential government shutdown. So to avert that shutdown, he probably has to work with Democrats. Well, if the Democrats work with him, they're likely to mandate or want Ukraine aid as part of that.
Right.
Well, that would give then the political power to some of the Matt Gaetz Republicans in the Freedom Caucus to call the motion to vacate on the speaker and to replace him as speakership. So he could put his own political future ahead of that. There's another option that happens. They reach some sort of CR deal, continuing resolution, where they do fund the government, they leave Ukraine aid out of that, and it passes potentially at some later date. But then the question is that could the House and this contingent actually move forward to try and remove said aid? Then they could also pass this continuing resolution. The Senate could vote it down and say, no, we're not going to fund the government at all unless you put in said Ukraine aid, and there's a late night vote that actually adds it on at the very last minute. My point is that there is a little bit of uncertainty, and there was also some inkling of this just this morning that happened. Multiple GOP lawmakers, both senators and House of Representatives, sent a letter to the Office of Management and Budget where they rejected the request for 24 billion and asked specifically about what the actual end game is by the Biden administration, saying we will not vote for this until we receive a real strategic plan from the administration about this aid, about in the future. Senator Rand Paul vowing to hold up any procedural event that leads to more voting for Ukraine. So as you said, 90% chance I think it will pass. Absolutely 90%. But there's a lot of chaos, so you never know. You never know.
The other thing that, just to clarify, I think the government is going to shut down. I mean, I think there's very little chance that it's not going to. There was a report in Politico Playbook, which is, the insider rag, whatever, about how Democrats are not even planning a contingency for it to not shut down. There is no game plan in place from either side to avoid a government shutdown at this point. Republicans in the House caucus, they thought maybe they had this deal between the House Freedom Caucus and the, what is their mainstream Republicans, is that what they call themselves?
Yes.
anyway, the more moderate caucus within the Republican grouping, and that whole thing completely fell apart. So, and that hadn't, that was separate and apart from Ukraine funding. That was just on, the other budget spending levels. That completely fell apart. So even within the House Republican conference, they can't agree on a continuing resolution to pass. And that's before you even start talking about the Democrats in the Senate or the Republicans even in the Senate. That's before you start talking about the White House. So it's very hard to see how they avoid a government shutdown at this point. And it's also very hard to see how McCarthy does anything at any point, even after the government shut down, without working with Democrats, which is why I think it's very unlikely that you don't end up with this next tranche of aid to Ukraine. Because if he's having to work with Democrats anyway, he, and by the way, 2/3, majority of his caucus overwhelmingly are in favor of continuing Ukraine aid. So I don't know how this is all going to work out specifically, but it seems like they're probably going to have to make some kind of a deal with the Democrats after the government has already shut down and after some pain has already been exacted on, not just the federal government, but the American people. So we'll see how this all plays out. But I just, I wouldn't get I don't want you guys to get your hopes up that there's going to be some real significant change here in the direction, because in terms of the elected officials here in Washington, they're still overwhelmingly in support on both sides of the aisle of continuing the present direction.
At the same time, there is a humorous incident in which a Ukrainian minister, or a spokesperson for the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, is an American transgender woman, Sarah Ashton Kirillo, who has been making incendiary videos now, basically since the beginning of the war. That have been going very viral. Now, recently, one of these videos that she had put out effectively advocated for assassination of anybody who goes against any of the Ukraine consensus, not just in Ukraine, but actually here in the United States. Just take a listen to that flavor, and we'll tell you what happened to her.
Russia hates the truth that their obsessive focus on a Ukrainian volunteer is simply allowing the light of the Ukrainian nation's honesty to shine brightly. Next week, the teeth of the Russian devils will gnash ever harder, and their rabid mouths will foam in uncontrollable frenzy as the world will see a favorite Kremlin propagandist pay for their crimes. And this puppet of Putin is only the first. Russia's war criminal propagandists will all be hunted down, and justice will be served as we in Ukraine are led on this mission by faith in God, liberty, and complete liberation. This is Sergeant Sarah Ashton Cirillo of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, and I'd like to thank the X social media platform for carrying this exclusive message from Kyiv. There has been much discussion recently related to my role within the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Before answering some of the questions put forward by Senator Vance of Ohio, I'd like to thank all those in the U.S. who are supporting the Ukrainian people. Without Republicans and Democrats working together on behalf of Ukraine, our growing and unstoppable success on the battlefield, and the inevitable victory it will bring over the Russian invaders would take significantly longer. America is once more showing why it's history's greatest republic and the world's lone superpower. And all of us in Ukraine are humbled by the support we're receiving from the American people. Let me also take a moment in my role as spokesperson for the AFU's Territorial Defense Forces to state unequivocally that we in the TDF and across Ukraine believe journalists are heroes and have the right to report on Ukraine's war for liberation without interference. Free speech is the pillar of all democracy. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, along with the rest of that sacred document, is ordained by God.
So, Krystal, the Defense Forces of Ukraine, let's put this up there on the screen, have now announced Junior Sergeant Sarah Ashton Cirillo has been suspended from the duties of the spokesperson of the Territorial Defense Forces of Ukraine while an investigation is now underway. In further statement, they said from the armed forces that the statements of Sergeant Cirillo in recent days were not approved by command of the TDF or the command of the AFU. While conducting military operations against the aggressor, the Defense Forces of Ukraine strictly strictly observe the norms of international humanitarian law. The command of TDF will conduct an official investigation into the circumstances of these statements. Appropriate decisions will then be taken. She will be suspended immediately pending the investigation. So there was the only reason that this even came to light is because of that video where she was basically, we're going to hunt down and kill anybody who doesn't agree with us. Senator Vance put out a letter being like, hold on, are we funding this person's salary? Like, who is this person? And then from that, the Ukrainians apparently took notice of what look, undeniably, she's become a hero amongst a lot of the Ukraine flag and bio people. She actually just got an award in Las Vegas for like from the city for being like a heroic American. It's just an example of like this unhinged behavior by some of the people who are aligned with this cause, and that we're being directly, in many respects, like propped up not only by the U.S. government, by a lot of people here who just love these types of statements. But, you know, ironically, it came to bite them because they're like, hold on a second, this is creating problems for us in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I think Zelensky choosing to investigate this person and fire her effectively, it's part of the charm offensive before he came to Washington. I mean, they cleaned out a bunch of the like defense cabinet ministers in an attempt to also show a series about corruption. So I don't really read into it anything more than that.
I think you're right. I think it's what they were like, oh my gosh, this could be causing problems for us. They probably.
I mean, they got a senator who's sending messages about it. What do they? They're like, all right, fine, goodbye. We'll launch an investigation. This is not worth the headache.
This is not worth the headache to put out this type of stuff. But you know, it does just give you an example of how some of their rhetoric, as we talked about with Letter Block, about the regime change and about is actually starting to invite some pushback in Washington. Probably not enough in order to do anything about actual funding, but this is just one of the latest examples. So wanted to give you guys that update. I thought it was funny. All right.
All right, so let's give you an update on the auto workers strike, set to potentially escalate as contract negotiations continue without resolution as of this morning. And this has created some very interesting political dynamics. So first person out, Joe Biden, came out with a very strong statement, I thought, in support of the striking workers, very clearly on their side. Donald Trump then has attempted to signal his support, his symbolic support for the workers, even without fully taking their side, by planning a speech in Detroit to union workers, not all auto workers, but former union workers, current union workers, et cetera, but in Detroit on the day of the second GOP debate. And so because this is how Democrats are, this has set off a whole series of pearl clutching and hand-wringing about, oh God, what do we do now with regards to Joe Biden? So put this up on the screen from Politico. They have the headline, Trump scooped us, Dems sound alarm on Biden's handling of the auto worker strike. Donald Trump's decision ahead to Detroit for a speech next week is setting off alarms among some Joe Biden allies. And the idea here is they quote a union advisor who spoke on the condition of anonymity to say that Trump is still himself and was saying do crazy shit. But they added he actually has people who know what they're doing. He boxed Biden in. It's kind of genius. Another Democratic strategist said Trump scooped us. Now if we announce we're going, it looks like we're just going because of Trump. We waited too long. That's the challenge. Worth remembering, actually, Trump did better among union members in 2016 than he did in 2020.
Yes.
Biden was able to double the margin that Hillary Clinton achieved among union members in 2020. So he does perform better with this group. But I mean, I just think it's silly, their whole concern. The question is whether or not Joe Biden should go and walk the picket line. And basically every Democrat who's advising him and every Democrat in Michigan is like, yes, go and walk the picket line, go make an appearance, go meet with these striking auto workers. The union itself has said, of course they would welcome him. I mean, who wouldn't welcome the president of the United States, regardless of who it is, to come and show support for striking workers. But they're doing all this hand-wringing about, oh gosh, now that Trump's going, maybe we can't go and it'll look like we're just following him, et cetera. I think that's so silly, all of that thinking.
Of course.
He should just go. And if he does go, I mean, it would be a big deal. No president in over a century has shown up at a picket line, so it would be an extraordinary action. And they're just kind of dragging their feet about whether or not it would be the right thing to do.
It reminds me of the East Palestine situation whenever Trump visited and then Buttigieg came afterwards and he was like, no, I didn't come just because Trump came. And he was like, it's ridiculous. But one of the reasons that we had seen behind the scenes was that the Biden advisors were wary of going after Trump had visited because they didn't want to seem as if they were following him. As you said, I don't think it mattered to the people there, actually, though, at the time, and I don't think it matters this time around. In fact, it would just be, you could spin it and be like, yeah, good, I'm glad he's there. It's a show of bipartisanship. The two of us support this thing. That's how things should in American politics should be, and that's why all GOP lawmakers should do the same. There'd be an easy way to play it from a position of strength.
Yeah, he could say, yeah, I'm glad to see him symbolically supporting him now while he was screwing workers while he was in office and giving away corporate tax cuts. You could use it as a messaging opportunity. And you're the president of the United States. I mean, you're going to attract a lot of attention if you take what would be, again, a historic action by going and walking the picket line. Put this next piece up on the screen. Jeff Stein's been doing some really great reporting over at the Washington Post about the strike and from the workers' perspective. And he's got this political insight here. He says, as Trump woos Detroit unions, Democrats urge Biden to join UAW strikers. He's coming under increasing pressure, they say, from some Democratic lawmakers to do something none of his predecessors appear to have done in office: join striking workers walking a picket line. He also is the one who points out, according to Director of Labor Education Research at Cornell University, that he would be the first president in a century to join a picket line. The White House declined to comment when asked if Biden is weighing a visit, but they say in interviews with the Washington Post, more than a half dozen Democrats in Congress and the Michigan state legislature said he should go. UAW leadership has also communicated to the White House that a presidential visit would be welcomed. So I think there's a decent possibility that he shows up. I think he 100% should show up. In my opinion, this is an absolute no-brainer. If you don't want to get outmaneuvered by Trump and his, symbolic nonsense, then there's a really clear path to doing that. He's already rhetorically, Biden has already clearly taken the side of striking workers. So this is just going one step further and actually physically showing up in solidarity for them.
Yeah, what I read is that one of the complications apparently is that the GM CEO and Biden are close, and apparently she's been making inroads.
Is this Mary Barra?
Yes, because she's visited.
She was a Democratic candidate for governor in Michigan, so yeah, she's
makes sense.
They know her.
So they know each other, and apparently there's some there's been communication about you shouldn't be doing such a thing. And you don't want to sacrifice our relationship, apparently, as the CEO. But yeah, I think it would have been a no-brainer. I agree. The easy way to not go outfoxed or whatever is would have just been doing it earlier or announcing it. Whenever it happens.
Yeah,
so
but even
I agree. Even now, it doesn't matter.
They'll think this and that. No, they'll just be happy that you're there with them.
Absolutely.
Like no one's gonna, think, oh, you look weak and you were pressured, et cetera. They're just gonna be happy that you're there, so showing support for workers. So don't overthink it, guys. That would be my recommendation. At the same time, thanks to our partnership with Status Quo and Jordan Sheridan on the ground, he was able to talk to workers themselves about how they are viewing all of these political machinations. And again, guys, thank you so much for helping support us so we can get this kind of exclusive reporting. And also, shout out to Jordan Sheridan and Status Quo. If you're able to support them as well, please do so. Take a listen to what the workers had to say about the politics of this.
Do you welcome a visit from Trump, and do you agree with him as far as we need to shift away from the electric vehicle transition?
I do agree with shifting away from the electric vehicles. I do agree with that. It's all about the support for us. I don't really know what to say.
Do you think in terms of the electric vehicles that it's kind of hurting the workers? There's not enough demand for it. Why do you agree with shifting away from electric?
Really, job security most to me. 60% less workforce means we're going to lose a lot of UAW jobs. That's what I believe.
What do you think of the former president, who says he's coming here next week to, talk to the workers? What do you think about him saying he would reverse these electric vehicle policies compared to President Biden?
Well, first of all, he's a politician, so whatever he says, I'm not going to believe him anyway. But the main thing is for electric vehicles, there is a concern for the future for auto workers. I think part of this contract, part of this fight has to secure that future, whatever it is. I don't think there's any way to tell how popular electric vehicles are going to be, how well they're going to sell. But we have to have jobs, and jobs that are secure jobs and well-paying jobs. So whatever that is, whether there are more electric vehicles being sold or less, we still got to make sure that auto workers have jobs, that we have to defend our jobs and our pay rate and our futures. So if they're going to be more electric vehicles produced, we have to make sure the jobs in the battery plants, for example, are union jobs, they're jobs that are at the same pay rate, and people have a chance to work there. Because right now, if an engine plant is closed, for example, because they have fewer gas-powered vehicles, The battery plants where there are going to be jobs might not be in the same city or even the same state. Yeah. So we have to be a way to secure our jobs as auto workers, whatever that future is.
What do you think about, the Biden administration gave Ford a $9.2 billion loan?
Right.
Doesn't seem, for electric.
Right.
Doesn't seem to be a lot of strings attached. There's not, demands for wages for workers, making them union shops. What do you think about Ford getting that big loan without some requirements?
Well, it shows you which side the government's on. They're subsidizing the auto companies, not just Ford, all the auto companies are being subsidized by the Inflation Reduction Act and building battery facilities in this country. So they're subsidizing them without any protection for the workers. But that's what the government normally does, right? And in my opinion, they're out there serving big business and not the workers.
Former President Trump says he's coming here next week. He's going to talk to the workers. UAW President Shawn Fain had some not so nice words for him, saying we're fighting against billionaires like him. What do you think about Trump coming here?
I have no comment about Donald Trump.
Not a supporter, I assume?
No comment.
What do you think in general? He criticized the electric vehicle shift, saying, if he becomes president again, he would shift away from this investment in electric vehicles.
He'll be in prison.
Okay. Do you agree with him? Because I've talked to workers who feel electric, they don't have job security with these electric jobs, and there's not enough demand for the electric. Do you agree with him, or you think this electric transition is a good thing?
I think it's a good thing. I think it's the way of the future. They're going to have to figure out how it's going to all work, where people are going to have to plug in their cars and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But it's change, and we have to embrace change.
So I talked to,
fun.
Those were really interesting. Good spectrum of, of views there. And, I thought the gentleman in the middle who was like, listen, we're not opposed to EVs. We just got to have job security. I think that's the general view. I asked Jordan, what was the overall vibe as he was talking to workers about the politics of it. And he was like, most of them don't want to talk about these guys. Like most of them are skeptical of both of these politicians. It's not their primary focus. Like they're focused on their fight against the big three, against the bosses, trying to win job security, trying to win decent wages. Like that is the primary thing that they're focused on and want to talk about. And this stuff over here all seems like kind of a sideshow.
Makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. While he was in Detroit, Jordan Sheridan of Status Quo was also able to get an exclusive interview with UAW President Shawn Fain, covered a range of issues. Let's take a listen to some of the highlights.
Joe Kernan, who's worth $3 million, that's his salary, at CNBC, he said, that's just optics, what the CEOs make. It doesn't really matter. UAW is deploying a, quote, politics of envy by continually hammering the CEO pay. Are you and the workers just, quote, envious of the CEOs?
I call it a politics of reality. The reality of what our members go through every day. I mean, the majority of our workers are scraping to get by, paycheck to paycheck. I mean, that's not envy. When workers start out at $15 or $16 an hour, and it could take them years as a temp to even get to full-time. If they get to full-time, there's no guarantee they'll get there. If they do, they go to 18, and then they have an 8-year progression to get to full pay. Our members are, this isn't the old Big Three where, it was the gold standard. When you got a job at the Big Three, you were set for life. That's not what this is anymore. And that's what we're fighting to bring back. These jobs should matter. And we're generating $250 billion in profits in the last decade, $21 billion the first 6 months this year. And our workers are falling further and further behind. That's got to stop. And, it's ironic, when, Kramer's comparing me to Trotsky or anyone else and talking about, the 9th class at Harvard is going to be Shawn Fain and communism. And I laugh, it's like I tell them, I come from Central Indiana. I said, Central Indiana is really known for a breeding ground for cornfields and communism. It's laughable.
I don't know if you saw Mary Barra. She, the General Motors CEO, did a bit of a robotic interview on CNN. She was asked, how do you kind of justify you're getting a 34% increase? Why shouldn't workers get? She gave some weird math equation that 92% of her salary is based on company performance. I kind of take that reading in between the lines as the stock price. Can you kind of talk about, because it seems like they're just doing this scheme of buying back the stock to juice up the stock so the CEO and executives make more pay. She's not specifically talking about like the workers.
Well, the worst part of this, like I tell people, when she talks about performance, she's getting paid and the stock price goes up and down based off the performance of our members, of our workers, because they're in there busting their asses doing this work, delivering great product. Sales happen, that generates the massive profits. But the sick, twisted part of this is, you look at the last 4 years, incomes have went up, sales have went up 65% in the big three. CEO pay went up 40%. Stock buybacks went up 1,500%. This is our time. This is we call this our generation defining moment. This is it. And so, and when I talk about not having limits, throughout my campaign running for this job, and even since then, when we're talking about our issues, when we put our demands out there, I can't tell you how many people would say, oh, you'll never get cost of living back. That's a thing of the past. Why are you fighting for pensions? We'll never see a pension. And all I heard is what we can't do. And unfortunately, that was driven by a leadership that had a can't-do mentality, settling for the bare minimum and making people think that's okay. The sky has to be the limit. We cannot limit ourselves on what we can achieve. If the founders of this union would have went into negotiations saying what they can't do, if they would have went in and they would have fought, or if they wouldn't, they fought. They fought. They got beat up. Some gave their lives to have this opportunity, and they didn't give a damn what anybody told them they couldn't have. They said, no, we're going to take it. We're going to get what we have to get, no matter how, by any means necessary.
I don't really care if you endorse President Biden. That's all that CNN cares about. But I am interested, you hear some verbally kind of pro-worker language. He did, stop a railroad strike at the end of last year. But aside from, occasional vague support, there hasn't been a lot of action. There was no push for the PRO Act, which would have, been a big boost for organized labor when Democrats had complete control. Biden apparently is sending 2 top aides here. I don't know what they'd be doing, but we know the Republicans and their views on labor. Do you need more from the Democratic Party aside from, talk and showing up when the cameras are here?
Yeah, the proof's got to be in the pudding. The proof's going to be in the work. As we said, our endorsements are going to be earned. It would drive me nuts as a worker to just watch. Sometimes we just endorse people, and there's really no body of work behind that. And we can't be taken for granted no more. Workers shouldn't allow themselves to be taken for granted. And there's a lot of things going on in this economy, and there's a lot of things with the EV transition. We're not against a green economy. We got to have clean air. We got to have clean water. We got to have a world for people to live in, future generations to live on. And but it's got to be a just transition where, labor has a seat at the table. There's a lot of money, with the IRA that was put in play with the government, a lot of our taxpayer dollars to help fund this transition. But again, like always, the corporations come with their hands out. There's always a way, the government finds a way to put money in their pockets, but labor gets left behind. Labor cannot continue to be left behind. And that's been our message to the White House, to Congress, and to anyone that'll listen. And so, that's got to change.
So you can really see there the way that his vision is to try to restore the previous era's understanding of what an auto worker job should mean. That it should be the gold standard, as he put it. It should mean that you can have a stable middle-class life. And by doing so, he's trying to redefine what that looks like for the entire working class, what the entire, blue collar and also service sector working class should be able to expect from their job. So, I think he's very compelling. He's very clear. He was just elected, as I've pointed out, and over the sort of historic, more company-tied leadership, the members for the first time had a truly democratic election. This is the leadership that they chose. They wanted to go in this more militant direction because they've seen the way that their wages have been eaten away and eaten away and eaten away over years. They've seen the way that they got nothing back after basically bailing out these automakers. And the latest information just this morning is that they've set a kind of a new deadline of noon on Friday. If they aren't able, which it doesn't look like they're likely to be, aren't able to come to some sort of a contract agreement before noon on Friday, they're going to then escalate the strike and bring in additional plants from the big three in order to strike and join what's already about 10,000 workers out of, I think it's 10,000, out of the 150,000 UAW workers who are already on the picket line. So you can hear a lot of clarity there in what his goals ultimately are.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting the way that he's phrasing it. It's very important, actually. It probably comes at the best possible time. I also think that his confrontational attitude, specifically toward the boss class, as you said, coming in a time of historic acceptance of unions, of growing political, I wouldn't say there's political opposition in the same way that there would have been, 10 or 15 years ago. So anyway, I think it's it's very interesting to see how he's positioning himself, but also to see how much, given the interviews that we saw with the workers, all of them, they didn't want to get involved in the politics. They're just like, look, we just want better pay. So clearly he is speaking, on behalf of them, and that militant attitude is reflective of what they elected him to do.
Yeah,
that's probably the biggest take.
He was very critical of Trump, saying we are fighting with every fiber of our being against the billionaire class and need to stop electing these people who are, basically screwing everybody over. But he also has been very critical of the Biden administration and saying, their big rub is not that they don't want to transition to EVs. It's that they want to make sure that those jobs are going to be union jobs. That's the big rub. The original plan of the idea of the administration, the Inflation Reduction Act, is that those incentives to the car makers would come with a requirement that they be union jobs, but that got stripped out in negotiations. Joe Manchin in particular didn't want it. And so there are now no protections in the Inflation Reduction Act to make sure that these new battery plants and the new EV manufacturing facilities are actually union. So that is at the core of this fight. That is a genuine rub between the auto workers and the Biden administration. It's something that, of course, Trump honed right in on and is trying to use to create a gulf there, and is obviously going to be in town next week. But from what I can tell from Shawn Fain and from the rest of the membership, like, those political fights are really secondary to them. They're very much focused on the here and now. What's my wage going to be? What are my benefits going to be? What's the future going to be for me and my family in this industry? And how are we going to make sure that we secure our part in it? In that way, it really reminds me a lot of some of the fights with the writers and actors who are also looking at the way their industry is changing
with AI.
And saying, this is our chance to make sure that we have a secure spot in what this future looks like with AI and also with streaming. And they can already see the way that they're getting completely screwed in terms of streaming revenue. I mean, just basically cut out completely from streaming revenue, whether you're an actor or a writer. And so they're saying, we're using this little moment that we have when contracts are up and when the labor market is tight and when we have an administration and National Labor Relations Board that at least is not going to completely screw us, to try to make sure we can secure our future in a changing industry. And it's the very similar dynamics here with auto workers.
Absolutely. I'm fascinated to see how it continues to spiral. It seems like the lawmakers the bosses aren't giving in here. So a wider strike obviously will really hit their bottom line, and we'll see if they can hold out as long as the studios can. I don't think so, given the current economic conditions. Just how united the UAW is, and their ability to stretch and all that. But hopefully it's not a long one. Hopefully
they seem very committed, and we'll see what the automakers ultimately do. The ball is in their court, as they say.
That's right.
All right, now we're going to shift gears. We have some special guests joining us in studio here. 2 Australian members of Parliament who are advocating for the release of Julian Assange. They are in town. They're going to join us right now. We are very excited to have 2 special guests in studio here with us this morning. 2 members of Parliament all the way from Australia, from 2 very different political ideologies, who are in town to advocate for the release of Julian Assange. We have Member of Parliament Barnaby Joyce and also Member of Parliament Monique Ryan. Great to have both of you here with us.
Good to see you.
Thanks for having us on your show.
Absolutely.
Yeah, of course. So if you could start just by telling us, why are you in town? Why make what is a very long trip to come here and advocate on behalf of Julian Assange?
Oh, thanks, Krystal. Yeah, so as you say, it's a long way to come, and the parliamentary delegation that's come from Australia, the 6 of us, is unique, I think. As far as we can tell, it's unprecedented for 3 members from our lower house and our upper house to come in this way, but we're also people from across the political spectrum in Australia, which basically reflects the fact that our electorates feel really strongly about the Assange case. More than 9 out of 10 Australians now feel that it's past time for Julian Assange to be released and to be allowed to go home to be with his wife and his 2 children. There's a real wave of support for him in Australia. We're very anxious about the prospect that he could be extradited from the United Kingdom to the States, and we're here to advocate on his behalf.
So to talk a little bit about that, sir, what are the issues at stake? Is it about standing up for journalism? He's a citizen. What are some of the issue areas that have united, all these disparate political coalitions to unite them to come to Washington and say this is something that we demand?
Well, let's go through the issues here. For me, it's not so much about Julian Assange. It's a principle. It's a principle about extraterritorial reach. Let's turn it around. Let's imagine a guy from Ohio, and all of a sudden he lives in Ohio. He's never committed an offence in the United States at a state level or federal level. And then Australia says, well, he's committed an offence for us. And then he goes overseas, and next thing you know, Australia's saying, well, he's coming to jail in Australia and he's going to stay there for 175 years.
Right.
The people of the United States would rightly say, well, what on earth is going on here? Let's go through some other things. Julian Assange never stole anything from the United States. A guy by the name of Bradley Manning, who then became Chelsea, who's then Chelsea Manning, did. And then he published it. Let's go through another thing. He didn't publish it first. An American guy by the name of John Young published it first from Cryptome, I think was the name of the website. It's just that Julian had a much larger reach. In Australia, Julian actually got a Walkley Award, a journalism award. Now, I'm not here to advocate. I actually think that morally it was wrong, but it wasn't a criminal offence in Australia, okay? And that's the big difference. And we've got other issues. We've got a lady by the name of Cheng Lei. She's in jail in China. She's a journalist. So what do we say there? Do we say to the Chinese, oh, well, you should send her back? Let's go back and say, hey, how about you work on your first fella in your own backyard,
right,
and then come and talk to us. So as a principle, it's where a lot of Australians have said, oh, this is messy. And I think for us in our relationship, close relationship with the United States, especially on defence, in New World, we see it as a mess and we just want it cleaned up and moved on.
Wow.
Ms. Ryan, how has the reception here in Washington been? How have the politicians that you've been speaking with, are they receptive?
They've been really receptive. So we've met thus far with representatives from the Department of State and the Department of Justice and a couple of politicians, and we're meeting with a number more today. And I think the thing that's really resonated is the extent to which this really matters to Australians. And I think people are a bit surprised. And we've heard on several occasions people saying, well, we didn't think you guys were that fussed about it, that worried about it, that you cared that much about Julian Assange's situation, but also that they weren't as aware as we want them to be, and that's why we're here, about how strongly we feel about freedom of the press and about protection of our citizens' rights. Right. And one of the things we've said repeatedly is that Australians have huge respect for the US. And our countries work really closely together in lots of ways, economic, on defence, and any number of other ways. And there's not many points of difference between the US and Australia. We have great respect for your Constitution and your First Amendment right to freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And we, I guess, expect a reciprocal level of respect for our press and for the speech of our citizens. And we don't want this to become a point of difference between Australia and the US.
Right.
That's something we're trying to say. We come here not to pick a fight, but to advocate on behalf of someone that matters to us and hopefully to strengthen the relationship between Australia and the US, not the reverse.
Well, it's a very powerful message. And so just outline some of the steps for what comes next. I know there's currently an extradition fight about bringing him over from the UK. If the US were to drop the charges, would that drop the extradition? You'd be free to go home? Is that what we're advocating for?
Saagar, precisely right. There's no point extraditing someone to the United States if there's no charge to answer.
Exactly.
Right now, Julian Assange was probably in prison for around about 11 years, in fact, more about 13.
Right.
But part of it sort of set self-imprisonment in the Ecuadorian embassy, and we saw that. But right now he's in a place called Belmarsh Prison, which is a high-security prison in England. He gets out for 1 hour or 2 hours a day. And if you think about it, you say, well, why are you in jail? Like, you didn't commit a crime in Australia.
Right.
There is no... And Australia's not like a sort of a backwater in a remote corner of the world that's, goes around deliberately persecuting people, or we have special laws. We're very similar on our common law principle and how the United States works. And we're trying to take people on the journey and trying to say this is not a right or a left thing. I was Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, and I'm from the right. I'm strongly from the right. And if we, in Australia, both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, who are poles apart in both, one's from the left of the left, one's from the right of the right, have both landed in the same spot, it really just calls into question, think about it. Just think about this principle, because we have a strong belief in the United States, and therefore the United States has such a leading role in so many areas of the globe, and you don't want one sort of barnacle to sort of sully your reputation. You just say, man, let's park this thing and move on.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we've got more than one barnacle at this point, but we can talk about that another time. Has public sentiment in Australia shifted? Has pressure been building on this?
It really has, for a number of different reasons. The first thing is that this has gone for more than 11 years,
right,
during which time Julian has married and he has 2 small children. who've never had an opportunity to live with him. And so we do feel like enough is enough.
Yeah.
In that context, Chelsea Manning has been tried, pled guilty, been found guilty, convicted to 35 years in jail, but then had her sentence commuted by President Obama. So she now walks free.
Right.
Whereas Mr. Assange has never actually been sent to trial as such.
Right.
And 11 years later is still being detained.
Right.
It seems egregious. That contrast to us really sits very poorly. But the other thing that's happened over time is that we have understood more about our own military's engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan and around some of the circumstances of that engagement. There are a number of criminal trials in Australia underway now or about to start of military personnel from Australia for potential war crimes. And so I think we see the information that Mr. Assange released in a different light now than we did when it was released.
Makes sense.
And I think that it probably, to some extent, it as well reflects some of the things that have happened in the US with the vision and the documents that he released. You know, with the passage of time, we recognise their significance and their value, and we would not be seeing that sort of information if journalists feel that they can't take classified documents and publish them in the public interest, if they're truthful.
Do you feel that there may also be a bit of an opportunity with this administration, because under the Obama-Biden administration, they were no fan of Julian Assange, but they evaluated the relevant laws and said, we don't see how we can prosecute this man without criminalizing all of journalism and criminalizing publishers and the other outlets like the New York Times that were also reporting on this information.
Washington Post, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, El País, The Guardian, all of those would have been drawn into the same thing, and they would have had to have been prosecuted, and the Obama administration decided not to do that.
And, you know, Biden was obviously vice president then. So is there a sense that, okay, potentially we can make the argument like, let's just go back to what was decided previously under the Obama-Biden administration?
Well, we look for the outcome and we'll leave the process up to the United States, and we understand that you can't turn up in another country with a process of duress, and it's really on the same principle. You've got to turn up and show your case, plead your case, explain yourself, and that's why we are here. My position is not so much on, as a person who has an involvement in the military in Australia, you know, I'm not here to justify on a moral basis what Julian Assange did. I've never met the guy. I don't even know whether I'd like him. That's
it's kind of irrelevant.
You probably would disagree with it, but it doesn't matter.
It's kind of irrelevant. And I think it's important for people to know that, because a lot of the times what people are doing is they're looking at the action and making a judgment on the process. As the process must be right because I have a view of this person, and you got to say no. You got to separate that. As you know that in law, the lady who represents justice has a sword. She has scales, but she's also got a blindfold, and you've got to be blinded to the person and not make a judgment. And let's see where that process ends. I just think on a cogent examination of it, people has to say exactly what you. But we'll have everybody in CNN, everyone in Fox. I mean, they better build a really, really, really big jail, because if this is the case, there's a lot of people going to jail, and that's obviously patently absurd.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep,
it's not just the journalists who would be at risk. It will impact all of us, because we wouldn't receive the news that we need to receive if journalists are afraid to publish it.
Is there any action that you would ask our audience to take to support your efforts here? Anything that people could do to be of help?
I think the really important thing is to think about the case and then lobby your Congress, your senator, make them aware of it. I have found in some instances, I'm surprised at the lack of understanding, maybe a view in a certain way after a discussion. But I think it's really important that people see it, and see it from me through the light of a process, and say, look, this is the United States of America. You know, we're not some Central American republic or something like that. This is kind of crazy, and we're certainly not the CCP in China. This is kind of the way they carry on, not how we should be carrying on.
Any last words?
Yeah, tell you, we're here because people lobbied us. Politicians listen to their constituents, and so we would really ask people to do that and to speak out about this, because it matters to all of us.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for joining us, for making the trip, and hopefully our audience can help you.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thanks for having us.
Had a couple of special elections this week. Both of them went in the direction of the Democratic candidate, and this led to some new analysis of how all of these special elections have been going, which points in a very different direction. from how the polling has been going. Of course, the polling has Biden and Trump very tight. It has Republicans with a significant edge in terms of the congressional ballot. But these special elections have sort of consistently swung towards the Democrats by double digits over what would be expected. So go ahead and put this analysis up on the screen. We want to make sure and flag this for people. This is from ABC News. And they say that Democrats have been winning big in special elections. On average, so not in one race or the other, on average, they have won by margins of 11 points more than the weighted relative partisanship of their districts. So whatever you would expect based on presidential results and based on what the normal partisan lean of a district is, Democrats have been outperforming that by about 11 points. One of the special elections this particular week was actually in New Hampshire district that is 6 percentage points more Republican leaning than the nation as a whole. It went for Trump, yet the Democrat won by 12 points. So that is an 18-point Democratic overperformance above their partisan baseline. Okay, so now you may be asking, does any of this matter? Well, that's kind of an open question. But usually, put the next piece up on the screen, usually what happens in these special elections does seem to correlate with what happens in terms of the national House popular vote. So if you have Democrats who are overperforming the special elections, they tend to overperform when it comes to the congressional ballot, when it comes to midterm or presidential year elections. They go through the data here. Now, the relationship does not always hold. There was a year here in 1997 and 98 where Republicans were overperforming by 12 points. But then when it came to the national House popular vote, it was more or less even. They were at 0.9, so not a big correlation there. But if you look at a lot of these other years, you can see there seems to be a trend of whatever party is overperforming the special elections tends to do well come the congressional vote. Now, you could probably guess some of the reasons that might be contributing to this, same as when the predicted red wave did not materialize in the midterms, could very much be, discussed with Trump and Stop the Steal, and crucially, abortion, which obviously has really motivated the Democratic part of the electorate. You could also say, this could have to do, and this may actually lessen the impact when it comes to a presidential election year, but it used to be that Republicans were the party that had more of the college-educated voters who were more likely to routinely show up election after election after election. It was more difficult for Democrats to turn out their base. That dynamic has now flipped, where it is Democrats who overwhelmingly are backed by college-educated voters who are more likely to consistently turn out for elections. So you could say, okay, well, maybe they're turning out for these special elections, but when you have a general election with likely Trump and Biden on the ballot, you may get a very different electorate. Another reason why you may have a discrepancy between what's happening in these special elections versus what the polls look like at this point is right now the polls do not have what's called a likely voter screen. They're just looking at everybody, all registered voters, and they haven't started to factor in, all right, but who's going to actually show up and who's not going to show up. So that could account for the difference. But it is very interesting to note that when people have actually been going to the polls and voting for candidates, Democrats have on average been outperforming by about 11 points.
Yeah, I think all these points are very valid. I think the only reason why we should all zero in, as you said, is they've been especially predictive. And look, in retrospect, they were one of the most predictive things of what was to come in the 2022 midterm elections. And also,
that's true.
I mean, the real thing is that I believe very strongly that one of the problems with polls is that they are unable to account for massive changes in a very short period of time. So one of the reasons that the polls were completely wrong in 2016 is that Trump activated a ton of people who just had never voted before. And so pollsters had not built that into their model. All of these white working class voters crawled out of the woodwork. They hadn't voted since Ronald Reagan and decided to come out to vote for Trump. The same thing happened with abortion. A lot of people who never voted before, never cared about electoral politics, crawled out of the woodwork and decided to vote. Also, even amongst people who do vote, these were people who increased their voting percentage. So as you said, even if you increase college-educated voters who usually come out to vote at, let's say, 60 whatever percent, they're voting at 80, 90%. That's why some of these rallies were happening. Well, that still represents a big change in the election. I think that these special elections are so indicative for that reason that, especially when we're living through such crazy times, nobody anticipated the level of voter turnout that we saw in 2020.
Yeah.
That was massive. Then everyone's like, Dems are going to get blown out. Midterms, they always follow the script. Yeah, but in the aftermath of COVID, all this insanity, and then Dobbs, it's like, oh, boom, we just had a big election. I think we'll probably have just as big a one. Big voter turnout is usually a bad sign, at least right now, for Republicans, because it just means newer voters who are entering the fray. Why in this moment would you be new to voting? For a lot of reasons, it's abortion. And if abortion skews dramatically towards Democrats. So it's a big flashing red sign, I think, for Republicans.
I've also seen some data to indicate that young voters, Zoomers and young millennials, have really been surging to the polls in these elections. And obviously that benefits Democrats. And I do think that there is a direct line between that and Trump, but also largely abortion. Now, the other side of it is, listen, the midterms did not have Donald Trump on the ballot. And the 2018 midterms did not have Donald Trump on the ballot, also when Democrats did very well. Donald Trump likely is going to be on the ballot this time around. So does that bring back the dynamics we had in the past where the polls then understate Republican support? I have no idea at this point. Yeah. But I will say, I think it's really important to take note of this data because the polls we've seen misses at this point in both directions on the polls, but when people actually have to show up to vote, I think taking note of that voter behavior may actually be more indicative of the direction that we're heading in, with a million caveats. We don't know what the economy is going to be like. We don't know what the war in Ukraine is going to be like. We don't know what inflation is going to be like.
What's the gas price?
We don't know what Trump's trials are going to be like. We don't know. I mean, there's a million factors between now and then. Not to mention, I'm sure there are going to be things that happen that we have no concept of right now and could not possibly name, even as a potential chaos X factor. So a million caveats, but this is really interesting. Let me put another one as a former Kentucky resident who's kind of obsessed with Kentucky politics. They're one of the few states that has elections on the ballot this year. Virginia also has legislative elections on the ballot this year. But Kentucky's electing a governor this year. Now, bear with me for a minute. Back in 2015, the year before Trump is elected, Kentucky had what ended up being a very canary in the coal mine kind of election. Now, people nationally, they have this conception of Kentucky as a red state. That's sort of true. But at the state level, back in 2015, actually, Democrats still held the state house and they held the governorship. So the Kentucky Democratic candidate for governor was significantly in the lead, seemed to have large margins, seemed to be beating the Republican nominee, a guy by the name of Matt Bevin, by a large amount. Bevin was this kind of like Trumpian businessman kind of a character. And out of nowhere, there was a low turnout election, and Bevin massively outperforms the polls and ends up sweeping into power, even though this was very unexpected in Kentucky politics. Okay, so ends up being a bellwether then for Trump, precipitates, Trump coming in 2016. Okay, so this time around, you have an incumbent Democratic governor, a guy by the name of Andy Beshear, who surprisingly is actually, even as a Democrat in a red state, one of the most popular governors in the entire country. And he's running against a Mitch McConnell protege by the name of Daniel Cameron, who's currently the AG. Put this up on the screen. This is polls. Take it with a grain of salt. They could be just as wrong as they were last time in Kentucky. But every poll that has come out of this race in recent months has had Andy Beshear leading, the Democrat leading, and actually by quite significant margin. So this is an internal poll, so always take those with a grain of salt. But it actually reflects similar margin to what we've seen in other polls, and it has Andy Beshear up on Daniel Cameron by a margin of 9 points, and he's over 50%. It's 51% to 42%, again, in the relatively red state of Kentucky. So if this result holds, that would be another thing to take a look at. The other survey that was taken this summer had Andy Beshear leading Dan Cameron by 8 points. So even though this is an internal, it seems to track with some of the other polling that is out there. So that is another one, another potential bellwether to watch, which has been indicative at other times in the past. Now, it's not the end-all be-all. Again, a million things can happen. You got Donald Trump on the ticket, who is a wild card in and of himself. But I think it's really interesting to take note of what is happening when voters are actually showing up at the polls.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, that was the most indicative thing of the polls, and it's why we have to zero in on it. And when you see a Republican underperformance, it's still a big problem, especially in a state like Kentucky. I mean, it's also smart for Bashir to be talking about abortion all the time. We already know from that law that went up for a referendum in the state of Kentucky that even in a deep red state, which, what did Trump win it by, like 30 points or something outrageous
probably
like that?
something like that,
It's something
yeah.
20, 30 points, just blown out of the water. They still can't get it past the finish line. So it
Yeah.
also, a lot of people, as I was talking about, who don't traditionally vote, came out to vote for that one. They came out to vote in Michigan, in Ohio, Kansas. I mean, the story is over and over and over again on the same thing. So any politician who's attached to that cause is the best possible thing that you can do.
Yeah, Andy Bashir is running a brutal
Yeah, I
ad
watched it
right
last
now.
night.
Did you watch it?
Yeah, it was horrible.
About abortion. It's this young girl who is straight to camera. And, you know, she's the picture of the, you know, white all-American girl talking about the fact that she, at 12 years old, was raped and that Dan Cameron would have forced her to have that baby.
Right.
It is brutal. And, you know, again, just shows you, even in a state like Kentucky, which is very religious, very culturally conservative, even in Kentucky, this issue is a killer for Republicans, and the Democratic governor is making as much out of it as he possibly can.
Absolutely.
All right, Saagar, what are you looking at?
Well, who is a journalist? Not that long ago, actually not that hard to answer that question. They work for a news outlet. Easy. But around 1996, when the internet really began to take off and user-generated content slowly began to eat into the attention span of Americans, it started to become not so easy. Is someone who just posts something that happened to them, is that person a journalist? It's a tough question. A tougher question is this. Well, we have well-enshrined rights as journalists here in the United States. Should those rights, as expressed in the Constitution and subsequent case law, apply to that person? I've always erred on the side of yes. In fact, I err on the side of even if you're not a journalist and don't even consider yourself one. I believe that if you're an everyday citizen, but then you produce an act of journalism, like let's say you're in public and something happens and you post about it, it should still apply to you for that instance. This is still the fight of our time, especially with the rise of the internet and non-institutional media. And the reason it matters today is how these people are treated by the law, as expressed in a troubling new verdict here in Washington, D.C. concerning January 6th. Now, Stephen Horn is a 23-year-old North Carolina resident. He was just found guilty of 4 misdemeanors in federal court in Washington, relating to charges of having entered the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Horn's case is different from others because he has claimed since January 6th he was a journalist documenting the event rather than a protester. Horn's case has garnered scrutiny ever since the day of the attack, when he posted video to his Facebook page documenting the event with the caption, quote, "I was in D.C. today when the Capitol was stormed." Horn did not try to actually hide his presence in the attack. He followed up with footage that was a post on January 7th, 2021. Here's what he wrote, quote, "I was in D.C. today, the Capitol was stormed. This is the full unedited footage that I took." He adds, quote, "This was not a peaceful protest. I saw many instances of pushing against police officers, as well as at least one instance where a barrage of projectiles was thrown." At the end, he says this, quote, "I did not enter the Capitol building as part of the protest or for cheap thrills, but to document and accurately record a significant event which was taking place. Feel free to share, download, repost this video, or any clip from it." The footage was from video that was taken by a helmet cam that he was wearing at the time. Now, D.C. prosecutors have argued Horn is a sham journalist, that he invented the excuse the day after the attack to avoid criminal charges. Their argument is that the footage doesn't even show him trying to ask questions of people at the attack, and the footage was actually not even that good. That I don't disagree with. They zoomed in on particularly on a photo of him standing atop an Abraham Lincoln statue with a camera that was pointed at the crowd in selfie fashion. The defense, however, argued a different story. They noted that the entire footage does not show him ever participating in any stop the steal chants. They show that he was never aggressive towards law enforcement. He did not destroy or participate in any destruction of property. In fact, public record himself shows that Horn turned himself in after the FBI wanted to question him in relation to the incident, and he even shared all of his footage with the FBI so they could identify other people involved in the attack. Since the event, Horn has produced a documentary on January 6th with an expansive list of tactical failures, the timeline, perspectives on crowd control, and despite his defense in the expansive First Amendment protections provided to journalists under U.S. law, The jury took only hours to convict him of the following: entering or remaining in a restricted area, disorderly or disruptive conduct in a restricted area, disorderly conduct in a Capitol building, parading, demonstrating, or picketing in a Capitol building. In my opinion, this is a major miscarriage of justice for several reasons. Number one is obvious. The federal prosecutors here sought to cross the line of First Amendment protections to go after someone who all evidence shows did not engage in any egregious activity in the Capitol except for entering. If he was a normal citizen, it would be a different matter. But considering the decent enough evidence here that he genuinely was producing acts of journalism and has since committed said acts, it was not worth bringing charges and going to trial over such a matter. To be clear, I am not saying if you murder someone and then say it was for a documentary, you shouldn't be charged. I'm saying here that considering how blurry the line is and considering how many dozens of journalists that were present within the Capitol on that day, that establishing a precedent like this one makes it more difficult, not less, to conduct journalism from this day forward. In fact, one of the arguments the DC prosecutors made was that Horn was not credentialed. This is an insulting and an antiquated consideration of journalism. Think of some of the most monumental footage that you have seen taken in the last decade. Very, very little of it comes from credentialed journalists. They come from citizens in the wild who upload that content for the world to see. The act must be protected at all costs. Here it is clear the feds sought to make a statement that crossing into the Capitol building is so awful that it is worth impeding on First Amendment case law. What do you think, Krystal? And by the way, I'm not particularly sympathetic to this guy because
it's a tough one.
It's a tough case.
Because here's the thing that gets me is he'd never done anything like that.
He'd never done anything before.
He'd never produced any journalism before. And so it does feel very convenient. And he was, he was on Facebook. He was like supporting Stop the Steal groups and whatever. So it does feel very convenient that the day after he's like, I'm a journalist, guys. Here's my journalistic footage. So
I get that.
I think it's a tough one.
I think it's tough. That said, look, if he had beat somebody, if he had destroyed property, I'd say,
yeah.
Okay,
I mean, then that makes it much more clear
exactly.
cut because those are, those are separate crimes. That even
crime.
if you are you're not allowed to beat people up if you're a journalist.
Exactly right.
Yeah, I think it's really a difficult one because, like I said, the thing that really sticks with me is he'd never done anything like this before.
If I had to guess, he probably did invent it, but I still don't even care because I think that the fact is that if you.
So how do you though keep from having a principle that anyone can just bring a camera and then commit a crime and then pretend after the fact it was all for journalism?
Well, that's the thing. It depends on the severity of the crime and what it was. So if he had destroyed a structure, if he whatever, any of those sort of things,
but
I think
it's just
fine.
trespassing. You're like, whatever.
It's trespass.
Yeah,
We're talking about a misdemeanor entry charge here, 4 separate one, unrestricted ground. I mean, that's basically making it so that if you don't have a press, for example, I don't have a press pass. Okay, so when I have to go, I have to get a visitor's pass. So let's say I didn't do that properly, but while I'm there, I'm filming something.
Yeah.
I mean, look, nobody would, but they could, and that's one of those.
But with you, I mean, it would be much more clear cut.
You're right.
You we do a show,
this
and you produce prior works of journalism, and so it wasn't just an after the fact.
I don't disagree. I still believe in the most expansive protection for the exact reason of always there will be the edge case, and on the edge case, we should side on the side of the First Amendment, especially whenever we're talking about misdemeanor. We're not talking about destruction. Yeah. We're talking about some BS trespassing here. Look, he probably invented it. To be honest,
I agree with that.
I really do. I really think he probably invented it. That said, I don't care. I think that the precedent that's being set here is bad enough that it's we shouldn't be bringing this charge. If he's a QAnon shaman or whatever, that's a whole other matter, right? But even on that, it's going to the length of a trial just to set a precedent for this. I don't know. That seems on the. I mean, think about how many people came out of Ferguson, right? Who were, they were right in the middle of it. Guys like Tim Pool, or I forget some of the others. There's a lot of journalists today, actually, who made their name on Ferguson. Not one of them were credentialed. They were just people with YouTube channels.
Yeah,
they were caught up in the melee.
The credentialing piece is obviously complete bullshit. Right,
but
there's a million journalists out there who are. But I mean, to me, the most compelling argument is it's a low since it's an edge case. And it's this low-level misdemeanor trespassing. It's all right, do we really want to set this? That's to me the most compelling. But do I actually believe this guy that he was there for journalistic purposes? No, not really.
I don't believe him. Okay, Krystal, what are you taking a look at?
Well, a new poll reveals that as auto workers have gone on strike against the big 3 car companies, the public is overwhelmingly on their side. According to Morning Consult, only 18% of Americans oppose the auto worker strike, in contrast to the solid majority, 54%, who explicitly support it. The rest are not sure. These numbers put opposition to the strike at about the same level of popularity as complete abortion bans and defunding the police. In other words, getting on the wrong side of this strike is politically moronic. Post-pandemic, Americans have become incredibly clear about their disgust for corporate greed and their support for the workers who our nation relies on every single day just to function. So, I've been watching with great amusement as many Republicans have just gone ahead and stuck with their same old Reagan-era anti-union rhetoric, while also accidentally kind of making Joe Biden sound way more amazing on unions than he actually is. Just take a listen.
It tells you that when you have the most pro-union president and he touts that he is emboldening the unions, this is what you get. And I'll tell you who pays for it is the taxpayers. You know, here, from what I understand, the union is asking for a 40% raise. You know, the companies have come back with a 20% raise. I think any of the taxpayers would love to have a 20% raise and think that's great. But, you know, the problem is we're all going to suffer from this. This is going to cause things to go up. And, you know, this is going to last a while. But, you know, when you have a president that's constantly saying, go union, this is what you get. The unions get emboldened and then they start asking for things that, you know, that companies have a tough time doing. And so I don't think government should get involved in this. These are private sector matters. But I do think the tone of how a president talks about unions and how a president emboldens them does play a role in this. And we're seeing what Biden has done play a role in this.
I think Ronald Reagan gave us a great example when federal employees decided they were going to strike. He said, you strike, you're fired. Simple concept to me. To the extent that we could use that once again, absolutely. The second thing that I would do, though, is very important. This is probably not a well-known fact. The first thing, part of the challenge that we have today with President Biden is, and I don't mean this to be disingenuous, I mean this to be sincere. I'm not sure if the words are bought and paid for, but it certainly he has been leased by the unions. And I say that because the first bill he passed, y'all remember the $1.9 trillion COVID relief package? Yeah. That only had 1% for COVID vaccines? It had $86 billion, I believe, for union pensions. Because they keep making these deals. And as a result of the deal, they promise too much, deliver too little, and the taxpayers pick up the tab.
All of this stuff, these strikes, these UAW strikes, again, are just part of a broader whole picture here, which is that the unions have paid off Joe Biden and the Democratic Party for literally decades on end. And finally, they got their man in the White House, the most pro-union president since Barack Obama, and probably more pro-union even than Barack Obama, who's too elitist. Joe Biden has been in the pocket of the union since day one in Wilmington, Delaware. Well, now all of these unions are seeing their moment to shine. It is amazing how we can keep relearning the same lessons over and over and over again.
Nikki Haley, by the way, goes on to proudly describe herself as a union buster. Tim Scott, as you heard there, apparently thinks that all workers exercising their rights to take collective action should just be summarily fired. No wonder these two are big donor favorites. In a way, I actually, though, kind of appreciate the anti-worker clarity of their message as opposed to Trump, who wants to signal symbolic support for workers, in spite of the fact that his administration was stuffed with aggressive union busters, which fits with his business track record also as an aggressive union buster. But Haley, Scott, and Shapiro here are giving Biden an accidental assist when they basically accept his rhetoric of being the most pro-union president in history. This is, of course, a wild overstatement. It is true. Biden is way more pro-union than Barack Obama or any other president in my lifetime. His National Labor Relations Board has been phenomenal, as has his rhetoric on this particular strike. But I am quite sure it will come as a surprise to Shawn Fain and a lot of other union workers and leadership that Biden is a, quote, 100% union shill. After all, the UAW has held their endorsement over frustration that EV incentives for new factories did not include requirements that those jobs be union. They might also want to talk to the rail workers who saw the White House work with rail bosses to cram down a deal that blocked their ability to strike. So yeah, he is better than Obama. He is better than Clinton. He is wildly better than Trump, W. Bush, or Reagan. But he could do a hell of a lot more than he has done. This commentary also completely denies workers any power or agency. It was not Joe Biden who voted to authorize these strikes. It was rank-and-file workers who elected Shawn Fain because of his more militant approach and voted almost unanimously to go out on this strike. These workers bailed on the automakers in 2008. They have every reason to demand that their jobs be decent jobs at a time when automakers are turning massive profits and issuing billions in stock buybacks. After all, These companies have spent $66 billion in stock buybacks and dividends over the past 10 years. According to Robert Reich, this would be enough to hand out $440,000 to every single one of the striking auto workers. So spare me your tears for the billionaires and their multinational corporations here. Now, for Haley and Scott, this is just kind of knee-jerk Reagan Republicanism. It's like a doll that you pull a string and Chamber of Commerce anti-union talking points come out. For Ben Shapiro, though, he lays out a lengthier ideological argument. He's clearly thought a lot more about this for why unions are always bad and had nothing to do ever with American middle-class prosperity, trashing as dolts anyone who thinks otherwise. Take a listen.
All the dolts who suggest that it's unions that made American life so wonderful during the 1950s, 1960s. It was the union job where you sat there for 10 hours a day doing riveting or whatever, and neglect the fact that a lot of those jobs, now is you sitting in an air-conditioned office doing another kind of job. And that your grandfather, who had to sit out there in the factory doing the riveting, would kill for your job right now? Put that aside. The fact is that the real reason America boomed during the 1950s is because every other place on earth was on fire during the 1940s.
So first of all, I don't think anyone's suggesting that blue-collar work is easier or more desirable than cushy office jobs. On the contrary, the fact that auto workers are doing demanding, difficult, physically taxing jobs only makes the case stronger for good pay and good benefits. But the evidence on unions helping to build the American dream, it's really pretty indisputable. This chart right here, this says it all. So the blue line is union density, which has been on a steady decline since the 1970s. The red line is middle class share of income. Lo and behold, as unions lost power and traction in our economy, the middle class fell off a cliff. More accurately, they were pushed off a cliff. Today, even with union power at a low ebb, they still benefit not only their own membership, but all workers within industries which are significantly unionized. So for example, non-unionized FedEx workers benefit from the fact that UPS is unionized. Tesla workers are likely to benefit from the fact that the big three are unionized. A recent Treasury report actually analyzed these impacts and found union workers on average earn 20% more than their non-union counterparts, and that non-union workers share in a spillover effect of increased wages themselves. Interestingly, they also find union membership is associated with some of the civic values that conservatives like Ben say they care a lot about. Union members are more likely to vote. They're more likely to buy a house, to donate to charity, to attend community meetings, to volunteer, and to participate in neighborhood projects. That all makes a lot of sense. When you earn a good wage and you don't have to work a second or third job, you've got more time and mental energy for that type of civic engagement. Still think that only dolts would believe that unions help build the two-parent white picket fence broadly shared prosperity that conservatives in particular harken back to? One thing I'm appreciating about this strike is how it creates a kind of political clarity. It's all fine and good to say vague things about the working class, but when the chips are down, what do you say? And more importantly, what do you actually do? We all know American workers cannot depend on the political class to have their backs and cut them in on the incredible prosperity of this nation. And that is why unions are so incredibly essential, because they give workers the ability to fight for themselves and to win. And a prosperous, empowered working class could actually make America great again. Thought it was very interesting to see the just sort of like reflexive anti-union talking points that at this point are so dissonant from the public. I tortured myself by going to the Ben Shapiro comment section.
Yeah,
and
what was it?
Surprisingly, it was very divided. It was there were a lot of people who were like, no, the unions are right. I back them, solidarity with them. There was one comment that was like, I'd love to see them get as exercised about the executive class's compensation as the workers. So it was really mixed, which is kind of surprising on his channel.
It doesn't surprise me because, he's always been very like discontinent in terms of where people, the right is on economics. He's always been much more of a traditional conservative.
Yes.
But he brings in a lot of probably like working class GOP types from culture. And so he very often doesn't go off on econ issues. But when he does find actually a split. It really doesn't surprise me at all, to be honest, to see the fact that the comments section would be split. If anything, it just makes sense and is a representative of where the GOP coalition is right now. A lot of average voters actually don't agree with him really on anything. I mean, many of them in a lot of recent polls, I think a majority of working class white Republicans say the taxes on the rich should be like double or much higher than
majority of Republicans at this point support unions, support these strikes. I mean, this is not close. And I think it also shows again how Trump, even though practically in terms of what he actually did in office is really no different from any other Republican administration, but he is so much savvier in terms of his rhetoric and in terms of his signaling. He is smart enough to realize just doing the like, I back the bosses and these workers should all be summarily fired thing is not a political winner. So much savvier on these things.
Agreed. Okay, we got presidential candidate Will Hurd standing by. Let's get to it. Joining us now is presidential candidate, former Congressman Will Hurd. It's great to see you, sir. Thanks for joining us.
I appreciate y'all having me on. It's awesome.
Absolutely. From my own home state of Texas, so it's always fun to see you.
I actually kind of forgot that you guys were
Oh,
fellow
yeah.
Texans.
He went to A&M.
That's right.
There's a lot of connection.
Get the Maggies. Get the
There's some
Maggies.
college station connection.
Yeah.
We have a big Aggie audience, so they'll be happy about that. We always ask the same question to everybody who joins us here in the studio. Why are you running for president, sir?
I think America needs a better choice than a rematch from hell between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. I think we're faced with a number of generational defining challenges. The Chinese government trying to surpass us as a global superpower, the fact that every industry is going to get impacted by advanced technologies like artificial intelligence. We continue to have a growing humanitarian crisis on the border, and our kids and grandkids are scoring the lowest on math, science, and reading in this century. These are the issues that we should be addressing, and these are the reasons I'm in the race, because we need someone that has a mix of foreign policy experience, domestic policy experience, technology experience in order to address this. And one of the things I've learned from my time when I was in Congress, way more unites us than divides us. Most people wouldn't think that's the case if you only look at social media and watch cable news, but I think we're better together. And the only way we're going to continue to make sure this experiment called America exists for another 247 years is if we solve these problems together.
Okay.
You can read a poll as well as easily as I can.
Sure.
Certainly former President Trump still has a very dominant position within the Republican primary. What is your sort of theory of what led him to find such appeal within the Republican base and leads them to still really, support him so strongly in spite of everything that we saw happen under his presidency, a lot of broken promises, tax cuts for the rich, in spite of him positioning himself as a populist, to say nothing of January 6th, stop the steal, and the, 91 criminal charges that he's facing?
And didn't build a wall and made it harder for agriculture in many parts of the states. The list goes on of his deficiencies. Look, he is someone, when he ran, he had 100% name ID. He is someone that has I think, tapped into an anger and fear of the future, and he's stoking those flames. And there's no question that he's the front runner in this GOP race. There's no question that I'm a dark horse candidate in this race. I understand that and appreciate that. But when you really start thinking and look at state by state, his front runner status is not as dramatic as it is in some of the national polling. And so there is a way we don't not have to accept Donald Trump as the nominee. It's not a fait accompli that Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee. And it's a matter of galvanizing all those other folks who want positive actions. But we have to win, right? Like, that's the reality. If we elect Donald Trump, and I've made it very clear, I think Donald Trump is running for president to stay out of prison. He is not running to make America great again. And if we put Donald Trump up as a nominee, we are giving 4 more years to a Democrat. And the opportunity for Republicans is to appeal to those independents and Democrats who are sick and tired of the direction the Democratic Party is going. And that's the upside, that's the opportunity. And we need more people voting in primaries. Okay. Only 23% of the country votes in primaries, and that's part of the problem too.
It's true. It's an important point. You considering your dark horse status, you didn't get on the debate stage last time. A lot of critics, I think, of people who are running against Trump, at least for the big race, is that you're splitting the ticket just like you did in 2016. So if you can't even get on the debate stage, and you said you'd reconsider it by the fall, why not support somebody like Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, or anybody who you may agree with more, who may actually have a chance of rolling up the anti-Trump vote?
Well, I've made it very clear that by late fall, early winter, it needs to be some consolidation. So I think that's the right strategy. I think Governor Sununu from New Hampshire had articulated that a while ago, and I subscribe to that. And so we're still, I've been in this for 90 days, I believe, 1 quarter. We had started with the lowest name ID and the least amount of money, and this was never about peaking today or tomorrow. It's about peaking in late fall, and so we're going to continue to push this. And if your viewers, watchers, subscribers want to help, go to hurtforamerica.com and give at least $1, right, and help a brother out because if you want to see something, something different, right? And so like I said, I'm a reasonable guy.
All right.
So you were saying that you see Trump as coming to power as part of an expression of this rage that not just I think the Republican Party, I mean, I think you can see a similar angst and anger that led to the rise of Bernie Sanders, very different people with very different solutions, but I think that was a commonality. Where do you think that comes from? And do you think that the, version of the Republican Party that, you hew very closely to, do you think that was part of creating that rage through failures around, deregulating Wall Street, through failures around the Iraq War, et cetera?
So this rage begins with a lack of trust in our institutions. And we've seen that lack of trust. And this is not just a recent phenomenon. It's been going on for decades. And that mistrust specifically within the federal government comes from when people run for office, they say one thing, and when they get in office, they do something else. And so that exacerbates this lack of trust. Why people are like, you're upset. Repeal and replace Obamacare. Everybody talked about it, but when Donald Trump came into office, they weren't able to do it. And so that's part of the problem. And so for me, the way I've always been successful is talk about the things you can solve, right? And that's how I continue to get elected in a district that nobody thought a black Republican could win. The 23rd district that I represented for 6 years was 72% Latino. And when I first ran, nobody thought I had a chance. And the way I won was because I talked about things people cared about. I solved problems that were impacting the community. And then I went around and said, hey, these are the things that I did. And so that's how we build trust back in this. And so, yes, I believe that these opinions and things that I articulate are reflective of probably a majority of the country. And the majority of the country wants someone who's actually going to solve problems and not just, have some fancy slogan on TV.
Well, what do you think about abortion? Do you think abortion is hurting the Republican Party today?
Yes, I think it is. I'm of the opinion, I've been pro-life my entire career. If the Senate put a 15-week abortion ban on my desk, I would sign it. But the other thing, now that it's back in the state's hands, the states that are restricting this need to be the greatest places on the planet for health care for mothers, for neonatal health care. The fact that in some communities, especially black women having kids in the United States are more likely to die during childbirth than in many parts of the developing world. Yeah. To me, that's outrageous. Yeah. And that's an issue that look, we can champion that. And our governors need to be pushing that. Our elected officials need to be pushing that. And so I think that's one of those issues that, look, I don't think you're going to change people's opinion on this broader topic, but you can be talking about things that we can all agree on.
So speaking of issues people are very interested in, big auto worker strike against the big three going on right now. You have somewhere around 75% of the American public on the side of the workers. Are you on the side of the workers?
Well, I'm on the side of, one, I'm not a big government Republican, so the federal government doesn't have a role in this. Two, having led organizations, when the organization benefits, the people involved in the organization should benefit, right? And so I don't know the details of the case, but yeah, if you're having a company that's making a lot of money, then you should make sure your workers are benefit. It's the workers' right. Now, so my issue with unions, look, if you want to join a union, that's fine. Just don't force people to join a union, right? Is my position on this. So look, I think.
So does that mean you're in favor of right to work? Like, would you work for a federal right to work passage?
I would not do that on the federal government side. I think there's difference when it comes to the federal unions. Now, again, I've worked with a lot of the existing federal unions, whether it's a Border Patrol union, even SEIU. When I was in Congress, we worked closely with them. But again, if people want to be able to join a union, they should be able to.
I want to ask you about Ukraine as well. This is an interesting. So we have some polling. If we can go ahead and put this up there on the screen, we've got a majority of Republicans who are opposing Ukraine funding right now. Considering your stance on this, and if the majority of the party doesn't support it, why do you fall on the other side?
Because it's the right thing to do, and here's why, and I'll explain why.
And Zelensky's here in Washington today, so it's a particularly pertinent question.
For sure.
Yeah.
So the issue is nobody wants to see a forever war in Ukraine. Nobody wants to see a lack of accountability of the resources or the material that we send to that, right? Like, these are things that we can all agree on. One of my long-term problems I have with the federal government, like, our ability to account for dollars spent is crazy. If you want to know how much money DOD spent on office supplies last month, it would take you a year to figure that problem out. So those two are problems. However, the United States of America built an international order that benefits us. And when we don't defend that international order, that hurts us. And the reality is, if Ukraine doesn't win, and the way I define winning, right? The way I define winning is pushing the Russians out of all of Ukraine. That includes Crimea and Donbass. And I'm probably more aggressive than most on that position. And so if we don't do that, and the Russians, let's say the Russians go back to February 2022. That's a win and a victory for Russia. Eastern Europe is not going to care about what Western Europe or the United States of America thinks. Western Europe is not going to care what America thinks. The fact that Macron, the French president, this summer, I want to say it was June, was in China talking to an American newspaper saying that, hey, America, don't make us choose. Don't make France choose between the U.S. and China. Ukraine losing is going to exacerbate that problem. Right? And I think the biggest issue that the United States of America is facing is this new Cold War between us and the Chinese government. So these things are connected. And I also, and again, I'm sorry for my long-winded answer, I think we would not be fighting a war the way we're trying to make the Ukrainians fight this war. So, the issue is not the percentage of how much money we're spending. It's about 5% of the entire DoD budget that is going to dismantling the Russian military. The fact that Russia has to go to North Korea to get weapons is a sign things aren't going that well, right? And so I think the speed at which this equipment and support goes is part of the problem.
So you would actually ramp things up then, spend more, would you provide the long range missiles they're asking for? How far would you go?
I would provide troops on the ground.
Okay,
right?
But Ukrainians using
So you're saying you wouldn't have
F-16s.
troops on the ground?
I would not have.
Okay. I just want to
thanks for
clarify
that. I appreciate you.
If the Ukrainian military uses a long-range missile to strike,
attack
not
sites
in Crimea, in Rostov,
yes,
well-established Russian territory, you're okay with that? Yes. So that's with U.S. provided weapons.
With U.S. provided weapon, and the counter to that is going to be that escalation. Yeah. Right. And so I think that the concept of escalation has gotten out of control. When the Iranians provided UAVs to this conflict, did we escalate against the Iranians? No. When the Chinese provided additional support to the Russians, did we escalate against them? Right. And so will the Russians use a tactical nuclear weapon? Right. Putin's role, and we found out what is Vladimir Putin going to do when he's pushed. We saw Prigozhin decide that. Yeah. And instead of escalating, what did he do? He capitulated, right?
Well,
now, he ended up killing him. He ended up killing him. Now, guess what? If I was Prigozhin, I probably wouldn't be flying around in Russian military equipment in Russia.
Fool. No question.
So again, if we want, at the moment, is Ukraine winning?
Well, the answer to that is no. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. But is Russia winning?
Well, it depends on what you look at. Right. They have an industrial base. They've ramped up their defense spending. Right. Their artillery production, all that outpaces the war. The sanctions actually haven't worked. I mean, I want to flip things around. So I believe that you served in the CIA at the time that we were at the war in Iraq.
That's correct.
Right?
Yes.
Okay,
correct.
So the Iranians were providing EFPs, these very deadly IEDs, that killed upwards of hundreds of American soldiers. Yeah, sure. Don't you think that was an attack and an escalation on our behalf? Or against us? So if the Iranians are providing Shia militias IEDs that are killing Americans, a lot of people in this country at that time understood that as an attack or an indirect attack against us. How is it not vice versa when we're doing that to Russia? And then what would stop them from doing things similar to us? Yeah.
So in my opinion, the error in that was we should have attacked the Iranian locations in Iraq. Not gone to war with Iran. We knew where the Quds Force was, right? Let's go back to Qasem Soleimani. Right, I think the attack on Qasem Soleimani was absolutely correct. And what was the response by the Iranians in that moment? They telegraphed launching missiles at a U.S. location that injured nobody, and then it was squashed. So in that case, we knew. So that is the example of how the Iranians were going to escalate, and we have an example already of how Vladimir Putin is going to escalate. And so will that force the Russians to do something more? So do you think that Russia would be able to defend if they attack something in Poland, or if they hit somebody in the U.S. and you get NATO forces in? The
That sounds like a nightmare. I mean, this is a nuclear nightmare
for Vladimir Putin.
Well, for us too. I mean,
but again, it's what have we seen the Russians do? And if the goal is
you may be correct.
Yeah,
you might be
sure.
correct. Just like the bet was right in terms of Iran's response to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. But if there is even a small percentage chance that we could end up in a world-destroying nuclear conflict.
Right.
Isn't that something that we have to take seriously?
Of course we take it seriously, but you make a calculation on whether does that prevent you to stop from doing something.
Well, we're talking
so let's play that out. We go to, let's say Zelensky for some reason sits down with Vladimir Putin and decides to have say, hey, we're gonna go back to February 2022. How does the world change from that? Okay, so we prevented a nuclear war, but then does that exacerbate America's role in the world? And here's why I'm concerned about this issue. Because of this order that we built, we've become the greatest economy on the planet. And if the Chinese government surpasses us in their percentage of global GDP, in their ability to work and increase their access to allies, that means the dollar is not going to go as far as we've gotten used to it. Our 401ks and retirement accounts are not going to go as far as we expected it. Our kids are not going to have access to the best paying jobs. These are the consequences because no one's going to care about us, because there's no such thing as security guarantees anymore. There's no such things as improving a cooperation between our economies.
Well, we have no security guarantee with Ukraine. Let's be clear. I mean, we do with NATO, but essentially, you said at the start, you said, I don't want to sign us up for endless war. You effectively, we're talking here about $24 billion. The intelligence community briefed senators yesterday. They said this is just the first of many asks. We've already provided $100 billion, the same amount we provided the Afghan National Security Forces over 20 years of war. If this is what they need on a quarterly basis, aren't you signing us up for an endless war? I mean, that's $100 billion a year expenditure for what you're talking about. Ukraine is our 67th largest trading partner. Russia is like number 25. 50% of world GDP is China and the rest of Asia. They don't care about Ukraine. I was just in India. They could care less about what's going on in there. Shouldn't you be managing this relationship that's happening here as opposed to risking a nuclear conflict over non-security guaranteed country and talking again about something irrelevant to the global economy?
Well, there was a security guarantee between us, the Russians, the United States,
the Budapest
Memorandum, when the Ukrainians willingly gave up nuclear weapons, right? So
well, it's not NATO. It's not
NATO, but there is an agreement in place. So how is the money being used? What are the objectives, right? Like, these are all valuable questions. We should be suspicious of the amount of money that is being spent. And I'm not saying, blank check or anything, but these are some of the conversations that need to be had. Now, I wasn't in the intel briefing or stuff like that, but when I'm president, we're gonna be having these issues because guess what? What was the failure in Iraq? Right? The invasion of Iraq was a failure, right? Yes. It was a failure because it was based on flawed intelligence and you ignored information on the ground. The consequences of that was long-term, the number of deaths, destabilization in the region, right? And then a long-term impact on the socio-political fabric of Iraq, right? And Syria. But there was zero plan post-invasion, right?
There shouldn't have been an invasion.
There was, of course. But I agree with that, right?
Yeah.
But if you're going to go, you need to have a plan.
So in your ideal world, because this is one of the things that I just struggle to understand, what does the end game in Ukraine look like? Because what we were sold, I mean, that's a nice thing to say, but it's not anywhere close to reality. And we were sold the idea that, okay, we've got this counteroffensive coming. Let's do what we can. We're going to ship more aid. We're going to, really fund this thing to the hilt. They're going to have a chance to break through and at least disrupt this land bridge that the Russians have to cry. It didn't happen. So what is the strategy now What does it look like to bring what has been a brutal and horrific conflict that has devastated so many people's lives?
And the
killed so many
Ukrainians are
people in
doing
Ukraine?
all of this. The Ukrainians are doing all of this
with our help.
without air superiority, right? We would never be fighting that war that way. And so the
we're a global superpower.
Sure,
They're not.
but we're also restricting how they can use the equipment,
Hold on.
right?
So lay that out for me. So what are you advocating for specifically here?
Continue to let Poland, and again, now we have problems with Poland today, right? Because again, if I was advising Zelensky, or yesterday, I guess it was.
She knows it's the Ukraine deal.
The Ukraine deal. If I was advising Zelensky, I wouldn't be saying, hey, be critical of your partners that are helping you, right? And I think that was a mistake with Poland, but give them F-16s. Right? Let them use the equipment
and
the way they want to use it. And again, so this notion that, so y'all think that if Zelensky attacks sites that he's already attacked with drones.
With his drones.
With
Ukrainian
his
drones.
Okay,
Not American drones.
So Vladimir Putin's going to launch a nuclear weapon into San Francisco?
Maybe he bombs Lviv, or maybe he that accidentally goes across the border into Poland, and Article 5 gets thing, and now we're in a full-blown
and
even if the nukes don't go, 500,000 people have lost limbs already in Ukraine. That's outpacing some of the some of the prosthetic statistics that came out of the First World War. I've been to the graves in France. Okay, we don't need any of that over here, especially over.
I agree
Ukraine.
with that. I agree with that.
Okay, we're obviously there's a lot that we could get into.
Sure,
of course.
On this. I do actually want to go back.
I appreciate this.
No, we appreciate the exchange.
These are the kind of debates that I wish we had more often, right?
Well, that's why we had the show.
That's the premise.
Yes, we don't have a time limit, which is kind of a benefit.
Absolutely.
I did want to ask, so you worked in the CIA.
Yeah.
We've always been curious to ask somebody who was in there.
Sure.
Do you think the CIA had anything to do with the assassination of John F. Kennedy?
Oh, I'm not equipped to answer that. Like CIA, official.
Yeah, I don't know.
No,
I mean, you worked there. You guys have to have talked about it.
Here's what I always say about. There's two things about movies about the CIA that kind of rub me the wrong way. It always shows that when you're handling an asset, their lives is throwaway.
Okay.
My one job. These are people that are giving us information to keep our country safe. My number one job was to keep them safe, right? I would never do something with an asset that would ultimately hurt them. And then the CIA is going to violate laws in the United States, right? Now,
well, it's happened.
Look. It was a different. I started in October of 2000, right?
Yeah.
And so the CIA was very different from the time when we were doing things in Central America and even in Vietnam. And my job was to stop terrorists from blowing up our homeland, right? To prevent Russian spies and Chinese spies from stealing our secrets, and to put nuclear weapons proliferators out of business. And I always tell people, if they knew how many threats to the country, there valid threats there were, most people wouldn't come out of their homes. Right? But it was a job that I loved and enjoyed, and got to do it in exotic places.
Okay. Well, I always wanted to ask, so we got a non-committal answer. There you go.
Well,
we appreciate you joining us, sir. Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
And you can shout out your website.
Yeah, sure. HurdForAmerica.com.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.